Welcome to the Streets and People podcast, where we explore having more transport options that are less hassle to use. Hosted by GetAroundCaboolture, we bring you 3 types of episodes. People and Projects share stories of change. Not Everyone Drives gives voice to non-drivers. Road Rules 360 unpacks road rules for people outside a car. Music by Grand Project, and let's make our Grand Project reimagining streets made for people. Today we're doing one of our People and Projects episodes. I'm here in the studio with Susan Leadbetter, who currently works in gender inclusive design in transport. I'm here in Gubbi Gubbi country in Queensland in Caboolture. I know Susan through Marina Miloshev, who previously came on the show, did an amazing episode about creating spaces that welcome women and girls. I've always wanted to talk about how do we create transport systems that are inclusive for all people and all body shapes. And so it's great to have you on the show. Thank you very much for coming on.
Great, thanks for having me.
Perhaps you could say where you're calling from and how did you become interested in this whole area?
I'm in London. I've been working in transport for around 10 years. My background is primarily in engagement and consultation, and that is about bringing people's voices into the schemes that we're designing, getting people's thoughts and feedback. And it was a time in 2021 I was studying part-time whilst working in my final year doing my dissertation, which is the final research piece. There was a huge incident within the UK, a very tragic incident of a woman that had been kidnapped off the streets of London and killed at the hands of a man. And it sparked a lot of global attention, and that conversation is still ongoing now. But what really happened with that really tragic incident is it opened up a conversation around how women and girls and other groups feel within public spaces, but not just public spaces, but how they travel, so how they get from their home to their destination, whether it's walking, whether it's wheeling, whether it's cycling or on a tram or a train. And it brought up all these nuances around safety and accessibility in regards to gender. Did this huge research piece where we spoke to over 600 women across the UK to really delve into what safety meant for them and their experiences and how it's impacted the way that they travel. And we've just taken that data and continued working on it and build it into our project. So it's been about 4 years I've been working in this space now.
And so what did you discover that was perhaps surprising or difficult about what you learned?
As a first research piece, it was very topical at the time, but I think I was really taken aback by the amount of people that responded. So to have data from over 600 women all over the UK was very overwhelming, and that data at the time hadn't been collected to that scale. So that in itself was quite eye-opening for me. And what was really interesting is women were quite thankful for me asking the questions, which I found really strange. But it was a case of, I've never been asked these questions before. I really hope that this starts to bring about change. And also what was very shocking, and why I've kept going with this work so much, is the incidents that women were sharing weren't small. Some of them were very violent, quite disturbing, and it really hit home just knowing that I was in a position to be able to change things and make a difference really helped me take that forward.
I'm thinking about times when I have been on trains, and I remember when I was a teenager, so it's a long time ago, and somebody just threw a $5 note at me as if he's going to pay me, so things like that. And I also had this very strange experience when I was a young woman where I spent the day with this guy, and then he gave me a lift to my friend's place, and he's going, so aren't you going to put out then? And this sense of, both of them are like, wow, where did that come from? I thought we were just finding out who we were or whatever, but this sense of, well, you're here for my purpose, or yeah, it really creates this sense of unsafety. And I've had lots of other very scary things, I would say. Just walking from the station, it's a 45-minute station to my place, and I had to do it one time because my bicycle got stolen.
Yeah.
And it was just awful. I was walking in the middle of the road, of a busy road, but I wanted to walk in the middle of the busy road. Somebody was driving by in a car park that went onto the street, and I just went, wow, is he following me? Because it felt a bit creepy. He wasn't, but it took me a while, and I just went, wow, this is really, really scary. I'm super delighted that you are starting this conversation. I know that other people are doing some research here in Australia as well.
We have offices in Australia, and we do engage with them quite a lot on this topic because it is something that's becoming more and more prominent, sadly. But there's a lot of societal issues, as we know, around safety, and education is very key and vital. And as a transport planner and designer, there is only so much we can do with that element. We can talk to local authorities, for example, and encourage them to do more education, but what we really focus on is upskilling our designers first and foremost, as well as our clients. So what I'm really focusing on is how can we make our designs better, and how can the people who are designing them consider the different needs of everyone, because it is predominantly a male industry. I'm not sure what the stats are for Australia, but within the UK, less than 30% of the transport industry are women. I think when you look at senior leadership and people who are in those decision rooms and the boardrooms, I think it's less than 12%. It suggests that within the industry as a whole over time hasn't really considered the needs of women and girls. And what we're finding in these conversations is because of people's lived experiences and how they've gone about doing things their entire lives, because it's the way that they do things, they've not realised that other people do things differently. And it's been really eye-opening just to start having that conversation with designers as well. Designers and engineers, they have set standards and guidance that you have to adhere to. Gender or safety is not something that's typically mentioned within those documents.
In Marina's episode, she says, let's move away from safety and move towards welcome. And I thought that's so good, because at one event I turned up and the police were there representing the police force. And this guy, he's, 6 foot tall, and he's going, yes, we tell people to stay, in places and da-da-da. And I just said, you as a man do not need to tell me as a woman how to behave in public spaces, because I really know it. One of the other things that we did with GetAroundCaboolture is that we were invited to participate on a walking audit with the council. And a lovely guy, he was a transport planner in some way, and I said, that's unsafe, that's unsafe, that's unsafe, that's unsafe, that's unsafe. I would be frightened here, 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 and here. And he went, I didn't even realize that. They're putting in these new bike lanes, they want to connect them all, but they goes in through the middle of bushland. And I'm going, no. I felt terrified doing it in the middle of the day. Sorry about bringing my own experiences to the table.
No, not at all. And I think that's a really great example, because initially when we started doing our work, when we were going out to talk to women and girls, or we started doing walks like you've mentioned, we were just involving our core team, which are all women, and going out and speaking to women. And then we were going back to the office and we were telling the designers, this is the information that's come back out of that session. It's not criticism to my colleagues at all, because they're great and it doesn't fall on deaf ears, but there's so much more power when it's coming from the individual themselves rather than verbatim and me going back to the office. So we went through a process of wherever we can, we'll get consent depending on the nature of the walk and what we're going to be talking about, or the workshop, making sure that the designers are actually in the room with us so they can hear firsthand those experiences. And it's not that they don't believe them when we go back and tell them about it, it's just it's so much more powerful and it resonates with them a lot more when you really hear it from them. What was really interesting is back in 2021, when I first started doing presentations on this topic, I had so many people industry wide, because we do a lot of outreach and it's not just internal, a lot of men coming to me saying I'd never considered any of this before, and then they'd go home and they'll talk to their wives and their daughters and they were like, well, yeah, of course, what do you mean? Of course I carry my keys in my hands, of course I walk the long way, of course I don't get the bus by myself or sit on the top deck. And all of these things that just people had never considered before, because it just wasn't their lived experience, so you can't blame them. It's just being in that environment where we can open up that conversation and make people feel comfortable sharing and talking and learning about it.
What have been some of the big changes that you have seen, or even small changes, maybe some really cheap things that you've seen people do?
I think that's a really interesting question, because I think it does vary. Something we're seeing a lot is everyone runs to lighting as the key solution. We know lighting does impact the feelings of safety to an extent, but lighting alone isn't going to eradicate all of your issues. I think what really is useful and the most beneficial is collecting the correct data. What we find within transport and planning as a whole is there's lots of data around, and it doesn't usually break down the data in segments in terms of demographics, for example. So we refer to that as disaggregated data, and what that means is you're collecting experiences of data as a whole, and you're not looking at how men are experiencing a place or a system, or women are experiencing a place or a system, or sometimes it's not broken down by age, because what we're finding as well, really interestingly, is your feelings of safety and security throughout your lifetime as a woman do change. A young girl in your uniform, for example, is something that comes up a lot in conversations. But then when we talk to parents who have children in their buggies, then their safety also changes and evolves throughout their lifetime. So making sure that councils are collecting the right data and asking the right questions is really, really key. And by doing that, you've got a clear set of data to essentially drive your next steps and what you can do. I guess that's more of a process. In terms of interventions, it really depends on the place and the transport mode that we're talking about. If we're thinking of cycling, for example, again and again, women and girls are telling us they like separated cycle lanes, so you're separated from traffic. There are various reasons for that. Perceptions of road safety, for example. I live in London and I've only really started cycling within the last few years, but more so working in transport. I work with a lot of people who are passionate about cycling, so I got more comfortable doing it with them. But in terms of aggression when cycling, women are more likely to be harassed by drivers. There was a research piece by London Cycling Campaign, and it was where women get slapped on their bums when they're at traffic signals, they get heckled, but also drivers tend to intimidate women more and drive closer to them. So having that segregated cycle lane is really key to encourage women to cycle more, particularly if you want your children to be cycling as well. You don't want them in busy roads with lots of vehicle traffic. Something that comes up a lot as well is where cycle parking is actually placed. So we're seeing more and more micromobility, which is electric bikes, e-scooters, which I know are quite big in Australia as well, depending on where you are. And it's great that they're being implemented, but what we're seeing is they're predominantly being put in big areas where there's retail hubs or transport hubs, like a train station or shopping areas, which makes total sense. But when you're thinking of getting home, there's nowhere to park that bike in a residential area. So you have that decision process of, well, do I walk this route at night where perhaps I don't feel comfortable or safe doing it, or could I get an e-bike, which is going to be quicker, more convenient, but then there's nowhere to park it. So having parking in residential areas is really key, but also making sure it's visible and lit and you're not sending someone down an alleyway to go and park their bike. Really quick wins. I don't know what the context is in Australia, but within the UK we have something called the British Transport Police. They're essentially police for transport system in the UK, such as rail. You can text them if there's an incident. They're generally quite good at responding. One of the issues there is they don't work on buses. So the bus network, there's a big gap. So whilst they're called British Transport Police, the buses aren't included within that. So what they're doing at the moment in the UK is trialling transport safety officers to mimic the same powers of the British Transport Police, but are specific to buses. So you've got that element of, if something was to happen or you did feel unsafe, that you can report that and have somewhere to go. Primarily what we're seeing is women want wider footways, wider cycleways, having options to use different modes and having that considered within the design process, making their journeys home easier. Something that comes up a lot as well is just the way in which men and women travel is quite different. We call that process trip chaining. What that means is women's journeys tend to be A, B, C, D, more unlinear, should I say. So that could mean on your journey to work, you're dropping off the kids to school, or you're going to get a prescription and you're making multiple journeys within that one trip. Whereas the male's journey is typically A to B, going straight to work. And yes, of course, it is 2025 and things are different now, but that is predominantly how our transport systems have been built.
Have you met with any resistance from traffic engineers or designers going, but that's not really possible, it's not needed, you know, we already do that, it's too expensive? What sort of issues have you come up against?
Yes, we're definitely met with resistance. I don't think that resistance will ever go away in some regard. Because one, I think the education element is really key. I think a lot of the time, once you actually explain the rationale and the reasoning as to why we're putting these suggestions forward, it does get through to people. Sometimes it doesn't. I think a lot of the constraints that we're up against is we always say to people, make sure you get us involved as early as possible within your design and within your scheme, because once you get to a certain stage and you can't make changes, it's really difficult to then bring us in. We might notice something and you can't go back and change it. Bringing someone in to look at gender and safety at the right time is really key, because you don't want to be in a stage where you then end up retrofitting things later down the line. So that's one thing that we come up against a lot. We've also met reluctance to do engagement. Essentially what our ethos is let's not make assumptions of how women use this transport system or use this public space, because every location, culture, context is very different. I'm based in London, but we do projects all over the UK, and my experience somewhere else in the UK is probably going to be somewhere different than in London. So doing that engagement is really key, but we're sometimes met with reluctance in terms of, is that going to open up a can of worms, should I say, and we're going to have all of these issues and we just don't know what to do with it. And that's why the transparency of our engagement is really important, and setting expectations of that engagement is really important, and being realistic in terms of what we can achieve is really important throughout that engagement process, and building trust. That's a barrier that we're met with a lot. But also lighting, again, I did say it's not the only solution, but it is still something that comes up in a lot of our work, particularly in rural areas. We'll see rural areas spending millions of pounds building and implementing all this cycling and walking infrastructure. Sometimes it could be through fields which are isolated with absolutely nothing around, and from my perspective that might be a nice leisurely route on a weekend, but there's absolutely no way I'm using that in the winter. There's sometimes no signal, there's nothing around, there's no shops, there's no other reason to be there. Sometimes it's quite isolating, and something we're met there is constraints with species like bats, for example, and that's really challenging and something that we can't control or change because bats are protected. But if you're building all of this infrastructure and spending all of this money and you want people to use it, and if it is a core route, I do think at a minimum it should be lit if you really want to encourage that use. Some of our biggest reluctance is that we're met with. I would also say a lot of the times it's actually quite small things or tweaks to a scheme that can make a really big difference. As I mentioned around putting cycle parking in a residential area, we also, I don't know if you have these in Australia, but more and more what's popping up are things called mobility hubs. It's like a transport hub with different modes. So essentially you could go there, you could park your car, you could then get out of your car and get on a bus, or you could hire an e-bike or hire an e-scooter, and you've got all these different modes in one place. And what we're seeing in some regards is they're again being put in isolated places. Car parks, as we know, can be quite intimidating. If you want to charge your electric vehicle, do you want to be racing around in a car park with nothing around? We talk about how can you activate that space. Can you have other land uses there? Can you bring in a shop, for example? Or even if it's in a town centre, could you introduce things like a daycare centre? And why that's so important, although not a cheap or quick win per se, but in terms of trip chaining, you can negate that additional journey if someone is already travelling there for work and then they just drop off their children into their daycare centre and then they can go about their day and go to work. So it's really, really varied. Sometimes even it could be a case of, when we review schemes, we look at entrapment points or hiding spots, which sounds quite a horrible thing, but sometimes by looking at that and just blocking off access or restricting something there can be really simple, but give someone that sense of safety within that public space.
What are some quick things that you can do, or easy, practical solutions that you have found that people have suggested or people have applied, maybe in the transport team, or ideas that people in the community have responded, said, oh, if you just did this, if you just did that? What have you discovered?
I think with that, it's never a one solution fits all or one solution and you're done, but some of the things that do come up within our work that are quite simple and a bit easier to fix is maintenance of public spaces, particularly on walking and cycling routes. So something we see a lot is overgrown vegetation that can create sort of dark spots and entrapment points, but it can also block footways for wheelchair users and buggy users. So making sure you've got maintenance budgets and plans in place is really important. When you're designing your schemes as well, I know I'm going back to lighting, I said it's not all about lighting, but just looking at where you place lighting. It sounds very straightforward, and engineers do that, but what we see is they place it under trees and then they don't have a maintenance budget to continue cutting the vegetation growth. So what we see there is you have lighting being completely obstructed and you've got dark shadows, and it essentially becomes redundant. So looking at your lighting placement and making sure it's in suitable and appropriate locations is a really simple way of negating some of those issues. Something that comes up a lot, and again very simple, and we should do it in all of our schemes, is just really simple, intuitive intuitive wayfinding. And wayfinding is so important for a number of reasons, but one, if you're not familiar with the area, it can really make you feel unsafe. If your phone is dead and you don't have maps or whichever app you use, it can really create a sense of unease or unsafety. What we see more and more, and suggestions we put forward, is put walking and cycling distances to destinations on your wayfinding. So if your phone is dead and you're trying to get somewhere and you don't know how long it's going to take you, saying it's an 8-minute cycle or a 25-minute walk can help aid that decision process. I was talking around rural areas as well where we can't always add lighting, and something that Marina did actually in her organisation on one of her schemes, and it's something that I really like and put forward on a lot of our schemes, is particularly on walking and cycling routes where you can't add lighting, have a map and show which routes are lit and which routes aren't. So you're not saying this is a safe route, you're just aiding that decision process of saying there's lighting here, there's not lighting here, and you're giving them that choice, because I don't think we could ever say a route is 100% safe, but you're giving them some more information to make that process easier for them. Another thing that comes up a lot is blind spots. Just having things like convex mirrors on bends or just mirrors to navigate that is quite a simple, straightforward thing you can do. And I would say all of those things I've just mentioned come up in near enough every single scheme that we do, and in the grand scheme of things are actually quite small tweaks as opposed to building an entire segregated cycleway. So hopefully there's some useful pointers there.
I've seen where they've done really bright paths, but when you look out, it's completely black and you go, this is really terrifying. How can you see around you? That's really the key, isn't it?
Exactly that. Depending on the scheme, we always say you should have multi-layered lighting, and that just means having lighting at a variation of levels, whether it's on the footway, whether it's up lighting in trees, or whether it's typical street lights, and making sure that those lighting levels are consistent and not having blind spots. We see a lot in underpasses that you'll have an underpass which is really well lit within it, but then the entrance and the exit doesn't have any lighting coming out and it's pitch black. So that bright lighting can actually really distort your vision. As a woman, something that always comes to my mind, walking in an underpass where there's restricted visibility and I can't see the end, there could be anyone waiting there, you just don't know. Again, not just focusing on lighting within an underpass, but making sure you're lighting the entrances and exits from above, and making sure vegetation is trimmed as well at those core entrances and exits, so you're not creating entrapment points for people.
Yeah, I was thinking about the bike routes and how that's completely entrapment and hiding spots. I just thought, yeah, there's no way I would be using that. As you were talking, you were describing a variety of different things, and I thought, what has been the most creative design change or shift or experience you have had from doing this work?
In terms of design change, I don't think I have a set answer for you because it's so different on every scheme. However, what I would say is changing the processes and the way that we do things has been really eye-opening and really rewarding, in the sense of actually going out and upskilling people and changing their perspectives and making them think about things differently. When we're talking about safety and accessibility of a transport system or a space, yes, we're talking about women to an extent, but it's not just about being a woman. Just everyone deserves equal access to these spaces and transport systems. There's a word which I will explain called intersectionality, and what that means is, at the front of it, I am a white woman and I'm able-bodied, but you have all these different characteristics of yourself that can inflate your experiences or change the way that you're perceived or your outlook in the world. I think that's probably the best way to put it. What we found is we did some audits on one scheme and we went out with a lady who's a wheelchair user. What was so interesting about that conversation is we were speaking about safety, and she said, well, I feel safer at night when there's no one else around because I'm in my wheelchair, and during the day it's too busy and there's too many obstacles, so I can't focus on my surroundings because I'm constantly having to make sure I'm not bumping into things. Whereas at night, when there's no one there, I can actually focus on my surroundings, and she felt much safer. And that really shifted my mindset, that shows that safety isn't the same for everyone. And doing the element of engagement and bringing people along on the journey with us and going out and finding out what their pain points and issues are at the start of the scheme are really, really important important. I think just that process of going out and speaking to people and finding out, do they even use the scheme? I think what's really important is speaking to people that don't currently use it and understanding why, and not just going out and doing your typical consultation where you have a website and you send out a letter in the post, because you're not going to get the underrepresented groups who are really impacted by the scheme and the changes. You have to think about things a bit differently.
It sounds like what you're talking about that is so remarkable and what is it, out there, radical kind of thing, is go and talk to the people who will use it and ask them questions that are open. Because it's true, we've got this community engagement process which really often feels so tick box. By the time you get to a community engagement, basically it's, do you want the driveway moved 10 meters one side or the other? I always think, actually, I don't think you're even interested in what I want, because this fear of opening a can of worms, it's outside the scope. How will we manage that? We don't have the resources. I don't know how to do it. And I think also, maybe I'm speaking to stereotypes, but traffic engineers want to solve problems, and maybe there's too many problems that they want to solve, and some of them they may not feel skilled to solve, but they don't want to open that can of worms, as you say.
Exactly that. Probably the reason why I struggle to ask that question around creativity to an extent is because I don't think what we're doing is very creative or groundbreaking. Ultimately, we're talking to people to understand what their issues are, and we're doing it in different ways in which we did before. So participatory walks, we'll go out on site with local people, and of course we're talking about women and girls, but we don't just engage with women and girls. Young people, people with different backgrounds is really important. Different accessibility needs is really important to go out and speak to. So doing participatory walks. On some schemes, I know we've gone out and we've had pieces of paper which are like red, amber and green, and we'll get them to go put a post-it note. Why did you put red, amber and green? What did you like about the space? What didn't you like about the space? That's been a really interesting process as well. And there's different ways in which you can engage. Sometimes we do focus groups. For example, we were working on a project. There was a hospital adjacent to it. So we went in and did a bunch of drop-in sessions with staff to talk about shift patterns and how they feel, because that's not a conversation we often have within our transport systems and the way that we create schemes. And just considering that within the scheme, a very small conversation, but again, very impactful to make sure it's documented. Like you said, we can't solve everything. There's a bit of give and take. There's so many things in design that you have to balance. But I think as long as we can show that we have gone through that process of finding out what the issues are, we've considered what those issues are, been realistic in terms of what's achievable within our scheme and in our remit. And it's not to say that we're going to solve everything within that one scheme, but we've got the data and perhaps it's something we can look at later as well. And just setting those really clear expectations when doing that engagement and talking to them, being realistic and saying we're not going to be able to solve everything, but what the information you do provide us with, we will do our best to do that, and keep them updated on that process is really key.
It's interesting you talk about hospitals and staff, because they're all shift workers, and people have work in the gig economy, and that's all shift work. So it's an interesting thing, this idea again. Basically you're talking about the 9 to 5 commute, which is straightforward, is such a narrow proportion of the population. It's very few people. I was really shocked when I discovered the commuter trip is actually only 1 in 3 trips. Everything else is something else. And why are we only asking this in our census? I don't know what your census asks, but ours is only the journey to work question, and that really shocked me. So if somebody is in the community, doesn't feel very empowered in their space, wants more gender consideration or inclusive consideration about the spaces we walk, ride, stand at bus stops, all those sorts of things, what do you suggest is something that that person can do?
I think as an individual, speak to your friends or your family or people within that local area, see what their views are as well. They might be different to you, but they might actually be the same, and they might have the same issues and the same frustrations. So have that conversation. And I think write to your local councils and ask them, how are these things being considered within your schemes and your projects? You can rally together with your community and start to essentially conduct local safety audits if you really wanted to. I know that's quite onerous, but I think trying to have that conversation with decision makers within your local area and raising awareness is really key, particularly for young people who aren't being typically reached within standard consultations. Their voices are really important. They have a lot to say. They come up with really interesting things on schemes when we talk to them. So I think trust that your voices are powerful and meaningful. Reach out to your local councils and try it that way.
And if somebody's junior in the transport team, because I actually do know some women in the transport team here at our local council, and some of them are in junior positions and some of them are in senior positions. Or even if you're somebody who's in one of the disability teams, how do you suggest they can help with solving these problems of designing our spaces that only work for a very narrow number of people?
I think educating yourself is really key. Stepping out of your comfort zone and challenging your own unconscious bias is really key. There's loads of resources. Do the work and go out and research, look at how different people experience public spaces, and once you've got that knowledge and understanding, start advocating for it within your organisations and start challenging the way that you do things and say, how would this person use this scheme? Why don't we go and talk to them and do it that way? I think education is really powerful, and then taking that education forward and advocating for those people that aren't represented or have a voice within your scheme or process is really key.
Yeah, we'll put those in the show notes. Is there anything else that you would have liked me to have asked? Any closing remarks? Any other thoughts you have?
The one thing that I would say is, I know we've been speaking a lot around safety. Again, whilst that is where our work stemmed from, like Marina, for example, safety is only one element of what we're looking at. What we're trying to do is make sure that gender is integrated at the start of our schemes, and we're making sure that we're considering how different people are moving and using a transport system from just an accessibility perspective first and foremost, and safety forms a core part of that, but it is much bigger. So as Marina said, it's about, do you belong here as well? So I just wanted to touch on that because I know safety is something that is a really big topic, but it's not the only thing that comes to mind when we're thinking of women and girls within our transport systems.
So I'm actually part of a social inclusion task group with one of the transport groups. It's interesting to talk about this issue because you've raised a whole lot of questions, and I think this conversation, how do you create a space that helps everybody feel like they belong, that they can, because I think that's really what we're talking about here. Like, this is always my question. How is it only cars get good quality transport and infrastructure? Why doesn't the rest of us get good quality infrastructure? What is that it has to be narrow? That's my bugbear, one of my many in transport, which is why I'm doing this podcast and Get Around Caboolture. Well, it's been absolutely fantastic to have you on the show. I've really appreciated the conversation. I've learnt so much, and I love this simple, straightforward thing. Go out and ask the users what is their experience going to be and how will they use it. Groundbreaking.
Exactly that.
Thanks so much, Susan. Thank you for listening to the Streets and People podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with someone who'd find it helpful. Your small action could make a big difference. We're on all the usual podcasting platforms, so don't miss a single story. To find out what else we do, check out GetAroundCaboolture.au. Until next time, remember, there's more than one way to get where you're going. Keep moving, keep listening, and keep imagining streets made for people.